In this lesson, the first in our unit on modern topics, we're going to take a look at the Civil Rights Movement. The Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court decision in 1896 said that states could separate the races in public places as long as the facilities were equal. The era of Jim Crow in the southern states did have this segregation in public places, but as these photos indicate, the states did a very good job of adhering to the separate portion of that ruling, but not at all to the equal portion of that ruling. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP, is going to take this on in court, and they're going to target specifically the separate schools law in the landmark Brown versus Board of Education case. Feel free to pause the tape and read through this. The gist of the argument here, though, is that separating African Americans and whites in school was damaging to African Americans psychologically, and therefore, constitutionally speaking, African American children, in this case, were being denied the Amendment 14 protection, the equal protection under the law clause. The Supreme Court, as you can see, unanimously agreed with this argument and therefore ruled that separate schools were inherently unequal and the state laws that created them were unconstitutional. They also added that states must desegregate their schools, quote, with all deliberate speed, end quote. Here you can see the attorneys. Thurgood Marshall is in the middle of the picture, celebrating their victory in front of the Supreme Court. The states were now forced to integrate their schools, as we see here. Don't think that states were quick to integrate their schools. As a matter of fact, it occurred quite slowly, and we're going to have a test in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957, testing the Brown decision. Here you're looking at Elizabeth Eckford in the photo on the right-hand side, but altogether there were 9 high school students, 9 African-American high school students that wanted to attend Central High School in Little Rock, which was an all-white high school. So they attempted to do so at great personal risk to themselves, as you can see. There was a tremendous amount of political posturing, including by the governor of Arkansas, Orval Faubus, who stood in front of the school doors and proclaimed that there would never be African Americans entering the school. Needless to say, President Eisenhower did what his job as president requires, which is to enforce the law, and including enforcing Supreme Court decisions, and federalize the National Guard to ensure safe passage into the school. And the students were escorted into the school daily for the remainder of that school year. The following year, this was no longer a problem. Central High was now an integrated school. Here we have a picture of the 9, the Little Rock 9 as they were known. Let's move over to Montgomery, Alabama, and take a look at the bus boycott. Many of you are already familiar with Rosa Parks, who refused to give up her seat to a white person that wanted to sit on the bus. There was a law at the time in Montgomery that African Americans had to sit in the back of the bus, and if whites wanted their seat, a white person wanted their seat, they had to give it up and move to the rear of the bus. You can see here the African American community got together and refused to ride the bus. Now, keep in mind that the bus company at the time, this was a private bus company that made its profit from the bus fare that the riders paid. Here we see Dr. Martin Luther King, who is going to gain nationwide attention as a young preacher in Montgomery, organizing the boycott. This boycott took about a year, but was ultimately successful, and the Montgomery bus system was integrated after this. The Brown case was a watershed moment in the civil rights movement, because if separate schools were unconstitutional, then in theory so were all these other separate rules, these other Jim Crow segregation laws. Unfortunately, the NAACP was going to have to go into court to get all of those other rules struck down, essentially one at a time, and now you're going to have other people, adults, college students, and whatnot, begin to protest, to look for a quicker resolution, if you will. So you've got sit-ins at lunch counters that you see here. All right, we've got the Freedom Riders. These were African American and white college students that were riding the buses to integrate the bus terminals throughout the South. You can see at significant personal risk. Here you see Southern white reaction, which you saw from some of the other photos. A lot of this was largely negative, and notice it was captured on film. Here, I believe that's Sheriff Bull Connor on the right, using the dogs to attack nonviolent protesters. You see the fire hoses, again, being used to attack the marchers in the streets. And this was filmed for the news, and folks outside the South were watching this and demanding that there be change. So in this sense, this was a strategy that Dr. King used to that's why the nonviolent strategy was so important, because Dr. King understood that the reaction would be violent from Southern whites, most likely anyway, and then the showing this on TV outside the South really made a lot of people very angry and demanded that Congress make some changes. You can see here the 200,000 demonstrators that came to the March on Washington in 1963 to hear Dr. King speak was very, you better believe that Congress took notice. You can see here the Civil Rights Act of 1964 essentially threw all of the segregation laws out. Now, I didn't mention the voter registration drives that were going on in states like Mississippi to get African Americans to vote, something that they hadn't done in the southern states since, in most instances, since the Reconstruction period. So you can see here, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 outlaws discriminatory voting practices, meaning literacy tests, and then there's going to be Amendment 24, which is going to outlaw the poll tax, where one had to pay a fee to vote. All right, to again make sure that African Americans could register to vote and actually cast a vote. I need to point out before we leave this lesson that the nonviolent civil disobedience approach from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was not the only approach. Here we see Malcolm X, who advocated a different approach. He called it black nationalism, where he advocated a separate identity, separating from whites, racial unity. And his slogan was by any means necessary, which included violence. All right, so this is, again, very different than the approach Dr. King took, but you do see in the picture at the top right, the two of them did meet and come together, even though they disagreed in terms of approach for equal rights for African Americans. So then, just to summarize the items in the civil rights movement, the Brown versus Board of Education case was a watershed moment for civil rights. Do keep in mind, though, there were actions taken, soldiers returning from World War I, soldiers returning from World War II. They'd had enough putting their lives on the line in Europe, and then to turn around and come home and be treated as a second-class citizen. So there was anger and, to a lesser extent, activity in terms of push for this stuff. But the Brown case really is going to be the moment at which afterwards you're going to have large-scale activity like Dr. King. We've got President Eisenhower enforcing the Brown decision. Then you've got the Montgomery bus boycott, which actually happens chronologically before Little Rock. The Montgomery bus boycott's 55, and the Little Rock 9 is 57. But the Montgomery bus boycott is going to make Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. a national figure. And he's going to go around and lead marches and demonstrations and protests and whatnot throughout the South to draw attention to the segregation laws. You're going to have negative Southern white reaction to all of this activity, which Dr. King expected, and the result of folks outside the South watching these incidents on the evening news really is going to lead to the legislation that you saw earlier in the lesson, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and there was some other legislation as well. That's the essence of the Civil Rights Movement.